Hey, it's Brock here with Rock Hill Farms, and if you follow this channel, you know that I've been accumulating saw logs and rough cut lumber that we've milled. Now, I don't own a bandsaw mill, so a lot of that lumber I've been taking to other people who own a mill and getting it milled there. And I've learned a lot about milling. I've got to run a few different types of sawmills, and I've also been using a chainsaw mill here on our property to mill up a few of the logs. And believe it or not, there's actually some advantages and some instances where a chainsaw mill can be better than a bandsaw mill. So tomorrow's video is going to show me milling this log up with the chainsaw mill. Today's video is about the pros and the cons between a bandsaw mill, a chainsaw mill, and even like the swing blade mills. So first thing I want to do is get this up into the shop, and then we'll get the chainsaw mill set up and kind of go through everything. So I've got the log in here and I just took some measurements. It's 29 inches at the wide end, 27 on the other end, and 9 feet long. That's a pretty good size log. But the truth is, pretty much all the logs I come across are at least that big. The two sitting next to it were about the same size, and the hackberry that was on down was close to 40 inches on the wide end. And thinking about the size of logs that I come across is one of the reasons that even if I get a bandsaw mill, I will probably continue to have and use a chainsaw mill. So in my previous videos using a chainsaw mill, I was repeatedly getting the same comments that led me to make this video. Those comments are, "That's too slow, what a waste of time, get a real mill," all that sort of thing. And I think those people might be missing some of the thought process that goes into, actually using this. So let's go through it. First of all, in an ideal scenario, I would love to have a sawmill like Nathan from Out of the Woods has. The problem is, that's like a $70,000 sawmill. And to justify a mill like that, you've got to be processing a lot of lumber and earning a living from it, basically. It's kind of a funny conversation, and it reminds me of every time I do a stump removal video, someone says, "You should use a mini excavator." Well, I already have a tractor backhoe, and it's not as fast as a mini excavator, but it will get this out without me spending any more money. Now, if I remove stumps all day, every day, or I had a dozen of them that needed out this weekend, it would make sense to rent a machine. But for one tree stump, I'm going to use what I have. And it's the same kind of conversation with the sawmill. At some point, you've got to justify what you're spending on it by the volume of logs you're going to process. So I've been so tempted, and I've almost pulled the trigger a couple times. I've called companies ready to place an order and changed my mind. And what it comes down to is I can easily talk myself into spending $2,500 for your lowest cost entry-level bandsaw mill. And I get all excited about the idea of having one and almost talk myself into buying it. And then I'm going through and looking at all the information and see that it can only handle a 23-inch diameter log with a 21-inch max cut width. Think, when was the last time I had a 20-inch log that I wanted to mill? I mean, I would come across them. Some of the stuff I use for firewood, I could turn into saw logs. But what would I do with these? I'd have to turn these into saw logs, or I'd have to continue using the chainsaw mill. And I don't want to spend $2,500 to $3,000 on a mill that doesn't mill the type of logs I come across the most often. And I can't spend $70,000 on a mill. So the products I would be looking at that would handle a wider log but not be fancy enough or have all the added features that you might want that drive up the price. It's possible to get a mill like that, maybe $6,000, probably closer to $10,000 to $12,000. You're going to be able to get a sawmill that can handle these big logs. It's a pretty major investment. Now, I've actually been milling quite a bit of lumber by taking logs to other people and things like that. But I don't know if it's $12,000 worth. And I've I've got so much money in equipment that it's really tempting to just continue to use what I have. So now let's talk about pros and cons between a bandsaw mill and a chainsaw mill. Then let's talk about your cost in getting into a chainsaw mill setup. So, obvious advantages for the bandsaw mill. It's faster, it's more precise, it's going to give you a cleaner cut, it's less manual labor, and there is less waste from the saw curve. Disadvantages, or we'll say it as advantages for the chainsaw mill. You can get set up much more cost effective. The other things that people may not be factoring in is a chainsaw mill is highly portable. So that means if I get a phone call, someone says, hey, I had this massive tree fall down and I don't need it, you know, do you want it? Or even whether they're trying to sell it to you or whatever the case is, I can take this, just set it in the truck and go to the log rather than having to have a way to lift and transport this log that might weigh 5,000 pounds. So the ability to take your mill to the project on a whole nother level, even than the bandsaw mills that are built onto a trailer and that sort of thing, the ability to take this to the project is a big advantage. The next thing, as I've already talked about, is that while still remaining cost effective, you can mill much wider lumber. So there are some guys who are real pros at milling and slabbing, and they might be doing 5 and 6 foot wide slabs. And for those, you either have a really high-end sawmill or you're using a chainsaw mill. And those guys are running an 881, not a 500i. And that's an expensive chainsaw, but still nothing compared to the mill. So there are real advantages to this that would make you choose it. So what does it cost to get set up with one? So if you have a nice homeowner grade saw, like a 261 or a 362 or something in that range, then you can run a shorter bar, and for less than $200, I think you can pick up an inexpensive chainsaw mill and start milling lumber with the saw you already have. Now ideally, you're also going to buy a ripping chain and a special bar, but those are not required at all. And the truth is, I'm not crazy about using them. In my experience, the ripping chain does give you a smoother finish cut, but it also cuts much slower. And I figure I'm going to be running it through the plane anyway, and those chains are different to sharpen because they have a different angle on them, and I prefer to just continue using my regular crosscut chains. So in that scenario, if you already have a nice chainsaw, you can get set up for under $200 and you can be sawing lumber tomorrow. That reminds me of another advantage to the chainsaw mill is storage. I mean, this is my chainsaw mill. It hangs on the wall down in my equipment shed and takes up essentially no space at all. Whereas if you buy a bandsaw mill, you now have to dedicate a spot for it. You've got to level out a pad and, you know, clean up the under the mill and everything. So there's a lot more of a time investment in that mill setup. Whereas this doesn't take up any space and doesn't require much setup. But I've been operating off the premise that you might want to handle wider material with your chainsaw mill. And in that case, you're going to need a minimum of a 70 to 80 cc chainsaw and maybe bigger than that. This is the Steel 500i. It's a 79 cc chainsaw, fuel injected, and I paid $1,070 or something like that. Obviously there was tax and then I bought chains and stuff, but I think the sticker price was like $1,070. Now this same chainsaw, year and a half later, is $1,500. Crazy inflation on all equipment, and that definitely applies to chainsaws. But if you don't have a bigger chainsaw and you need to buy the saw, you are going to spend quite a bit on a chainsaw that's big enough to handle it. And honestly, if I was buying a chainsaw with the primary purpose of milling lumber, I would get at least a 661. And I think those are running around $2,100. Don't quote me on that, but I think they're in that price range. So your cost to get started in this is completely dependent on whether or not you already have a good saw to use. Because your Alaskan sawmills are going to cost between $100 and $300. I'll put links in the video description to the 2 mills I use. And tomorrow, I'm going to work that log up, and I hope you come back and check that out. Now, most of the chainsaw milling I've done, I just worked straight down it and just slabbed it with the live edge. And that's not my plan for tomorrow. Tomorrow, I'm going to try to do this the right way, which will be more challenging. That is to square off all 4 sides and get a cant and make true dimensional lumber and go through the process the same way you will with a bandsaw mill. And I expect that to be a lot of work, and I'll find out if it's worth it or not. So come back and check that video out. I appreciate you taking time to watch this video. I'll put links to more of our videos on the screen, and I'll see you next time.